So as I mentioned before, strings are alphanumeric characters. So strings are the data type that contain letters, numbers, and characters. And it's one of the most commonly used data types in App Inventor. So we'll go to the string section of the code here. And as you can see, this is what the interface of the app looks like here. The strings data type has a number of different operations that you could perform on strings, and you could find those in the text section of the blocks. And so you could do things like compare text. You could trim, which basically removes any what's known as white space. So if there's a space on either side of a string, it'll just remove that. You could change text from lowercase to uppercase and uppercase to lowercase in this instance. You can find where a substring of a string is located. So, for example, if you have a name like John Doe, you can search for Doe within that string, and it'll tell you at what point, using a number, where that string lies. And we'll show you that in a second. Contains text. You could see if a string contains some type of other string. You could split text at certain characters. For example, if you have a list of cities that are separated by a comma, you can go ahead and split those out and separate them out into a list. Split at spaces, same thing, but just with spaces. Segment text, you can basically take a certain segment of a text where you're given the text, you give the starting position, 1 being the first letter or first character in the text, and then 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth, and then the length. So you could just grab a piece of a string. You could replace text. You could say, if again, given the example of John Doe, I want to change it to Jane Doe. So look for John and replace it to Jane. Obfuscated text, that's for cryptography based, or I should say encryption, but I would not use this. Stay away from that. And then this logical operator called is a string. So you could say, okay, well, is this variable a string? If it is, it will return true. If not, for example, if it's a Boolean, it will return false. So those are all the operations, and I will demo several of these in the app here. Let me close this. So this screen has a text that you enter, a section for finding text and replacing texts, and you could choose your operation and then evaluate. So this long block basically goes through each of these cases here. So let's go through the first one. Let's say today is Monday, so we will say Monday, and I will make that all uppercase. Evaluate, and it'll change Monday from title case to all uppercase. Then lowercase, that just does the opposite. Let's say get length. If we select get length and click evaluate, it gives the length of the string. In this case, it's 7, and it's 7 because I have a gap there. So if I remove that space at the end and evaluate, I should get 6. So there's an example of when you should use the trim operation. So if you are having users enter data into a text field and they accidentally enter a space, you want to kind of sanitize that text by running the trim operation, and it'll just remove that. Let's see, the next operation we could use is split at comma. So here we'll do what's known as a comma separated list, and I'll say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then I will evaluate that, and it will list Wednesday. It'll go from the back to the front. So Wednesday, it'll say Tuesday and Monday. So what happened here, and we'll look at the code here for a quick second, is it creates an empty list. And we're going to go into lists in the next section, but it creates an empty list, and then it will append the days to the list after it splits out the texts at comma. So it says, okay, for each comma, go down this string and give me the text that is in each comma, and then add it to a list, and then we're looping over this list and printing out that message onto the screen. So we're going to get into loops and lists in a second, but here's an example of one in action. So this is a very common way of importing and exporting data, is using a comma separated list like that, and so splitting strings at either commas or spaces or tabs is a very common operation you'll do in programming. Let's see, the next operation, find substring. So let's see, we will say John Doe, and we'll say, let's make sure I have find substring selected, find text and Doe. Let's see, evaluate, and it'll say 6. So 6 is the index number of where Doe starts. So J being 1, O being 2, H being 3, N being 4, the space being 5, and then D being 6. So that's why we return 6. It's giving you the position in that whole text string of where it occurs. Now, be aware that this operation is case sensitive. So if I say, not Doe, done, but Doe, if I do that, I will get a 0. And 0 means that that text was not found within the whole string. Let's see, what's the next? The next operation is empty. So this is another good one for data validation, to make sure that any text field that you have that is required, make sure that that is empty returns false. So that users will always have to put in a text field. So for example, if you have a user registration and you need their first name and last name, those are going to be required fields. So you want to check those those inputs to make sure that the field is not empty. So if I evaluate is empty, and it'll say text box is empty. Now if I just add some data in there and evaluate, text box is not empty. Again, so that's a very good one to know. And then finally, replace text. Let's see, we'll go back to our John Doe example. And John, we will change, let's see, find text, we will look for John. Again, this is case sensitive, so make sure you do that, with a capital J, and then replace text. And we will, John is now Jane. We will evaluate, and it says Jane Doe. So it looks for John, removes John, and adds Jane. And that, again, is something that is very common when you're working in programming, is to replace text within a string. with that said, we will move on to conditionals, or excuse me, booleans.